The illusion of consciousness. Who do we think we are, and why does it matter? Have we evolved the need for a belief in the self or consciousness? If so, what function is there in believing we are unique and individual? If we are solely the result of an extremely complex set of reactions, why would the belief in a self arise? Is believing you are individual integral to self-preservation? Would the next step in the evolution of the human psyche be the loss of a belief in the self and the death of the third higher narrative? What is a higher narrative? A higher narrative is an overarching story we tell ourselves that gives us the feeling all is okay. It's a belief system we all share that allows us to pass the buck of responsibility to a higher power, and in so doing, we feel better about the incredibly fragile life we have. The first higher narrative was God. This was questioned and lost during the Renaissance. This by no means negates the possibility that God exists. It's purely the loss of a belief as a higher narrative shared by the majority that was lost. Then, humanism, and the idea that leading moral individuals held the answer to big questions and by whom order was kept was the second higher narrative to be born. This was killed by the death of the modern world and birth of the postmodern world. Vietnam assassinations, the Holocaust, and nuclear attacks played a large part. The remaining higher narrative and the refuge all humans now turn to is the self, ego, or consciousness. But what is consciousness? Some have suggested that the self doesn't exist, but consciousness does. Are these not one in the same? Do we have the same base consciousness as each other? If so, is that our individual consciousness? Or is it one shared when the conscious experience of the general world subsides? Either way, the current best definition of consciousness is what it feels like to be something. If it feels like something to be a cat or even a snail, it means the cat and a snail are conscious. This definition falls apart when you either imagine what it's like to experience a very small or large conscious mind. Imagine you're a simple plant. All you feel is the wind moving your delicate stem. Maybe you feel a bug crawl up one of your leaves, the rain hitting all of your leaves, or even water slowly moving up through you. This is an exercise in reality of only a human mind adding a plant as a limb. The experience a plant has will be something entirely different, as a plant does not have up to 1,000 trillion synaptic connections happening each second. Then on the other end of the scale, how could you possibly imagine the experience of a being with 1,000 octillion synaptic connections? Another definition of consciousness is self-awareness. If a being is aware that it exists, that it sees itself as an individual, one that is separate from the world, with an internal dialogue or internal existence, is it conscious? This of course falls apart for animals or even some plants that exhibit traits of conscious awareness but no internal conscious awareness. Some trees, for example, keep a connection to all the trees that have grown from its seeds, and as they grow around that tree, more space is given to them to grow, while other plants and trees are ignored. Does this mean that the tree is thinking about its siblings? You could have a computer that processes at the same rate as a human brain and even synthesize dreams. Would you say this is a conscious being? Slightly out of the field of the general theories is panpsychism. This postulates that consciousness is an inherent property of all matter. This theory is hard to prove for the reason that consciousness itself is not properly defined. So testing for something that we don't understand yet is impossible. Although this theory is not generally accepted in mainstream science, it is entertained by a surprisingly large number of people. What attracts thinkers to this theory is that it releases us from the illusory line of sudden emergent properties of consciousness. And it also solves all problems in micro and macro consciousness. The problem with this theory is that it would mean quarks are conscious, and so is every supermassive black hole. If this were to be true, there should be some evidence of this consciousness. Some may say the observer effect in the double slit experiment or spooky action of quantum entanglement would be evidence, but the observer effect is not determined by a conscious observer, and neither is entanglement. You'd get the same different spooky results if a computer were programmed to look for particles or waves, as you would if a sentient being were to look for the right or left spin. When describing a car, we describe it simply as a car. But this doesn't mean that the car exists in itself, nor does it mean the car has emerged suddenly from the sum of its parts. The definition car is purely a definition of the sum of all the parts. It could be simply described as a time-saving term. Strangely, we have done the same time-saving in regards to consciousness, but instead of applying the term after understanding consciousness, we've done it before. The idea of consciousness is the next great mystery to die. Science has destroyed the soul. It is in the process of destroying the self and will inevitably destroy consciousness. As a caveat, this statement does not mean there is no soul and all religions are lost, but the theory that a soul exists is of religion, not science, and until these two can reconcile their differences, it's probably wise to keep them as separate entities. Reductionism may be branded as scientism, but the universe is a universe of principles and laws. There must be logical understanding in a logical universe. If we are to understand what creates consciousness, we simply need to look at what physically creates it. Consciousness is simply reactivity. This is to say that consciousness doesn't really exist. It is purely a name attached to a set of systems, in our case the human experience. What's going on then? Can we track conscious experience to better understand it? As life has evolved, its interaction with the world around it has also evolved. The simple collision of particles is an interaction, and then in turn the trillions of interactions of our synapses are still simply physical interactions. This internal dialogue we label consciousness is simply the continuation of interactions with the inside and outside world, planning, preempting, and assigning memories, etc. But what could be gained from a third-person perspective? It's been said that you cannot see the forest for the trees. Could this faculty not have evolved in the same way all other human attributes such as speech have evolved? In conclusion, consciousness is a word assigned to humans, or a yet-to-be-decided group of worthy animals' mental activity. In reality, a brain not only works when reacting to external influences, it also works in preparation to external influences, even when those influences have subsided or are yet to happen. This activity can be called consciousness. But this does not mean any extra lights are on apart from the usual synaptic transmissions. From the first particle to interact with another at the beginning of our universe, to the meeting of the two most advanced beings in the distant future, it's simply a reaction. All that has changed is the scale and complexity.